They say the world was never meant to be a shrine. And yet here, beneath a sky that keeps its light to itself, an entire planet has been taught to sleep like one. Listen first to the wind. It moves across the ramparts in long, patient breaths, a sound like cloth pulled over metal, like a hand tracing the ribs of a cathedral. It gathers in the hollows between bastions and whistles down broken gutters, carrying with it the smell of cold iron and the brittle dust of old battles. The wind knows every crack in the wall. It knows the way the stones have shifted over centuries. It tells the same story in 100 different languages, an arithmetic of erosion, a ledger of small defeats that no bell will ever toll. Above, the sky is a lid. Stars have been smothered by ash, by the glare of distant sieges, by the habit of an empire to burn away the dark. There is no canopy of glitter to reassure the eye, no far-off promise of a sun about to rise. The stars here are few and indifferent, as if the heavens have learned not to offer counsel to worlds that insist on answering in violence. In the absence of celestial comfort, the bastions keep their own hours. They mark time in the ticking of servos, in the slow cooling of reactors, in the tiny incandescent hearts of coolant pipes that pulse faintly like veins. This is a fortress world. The meaning of that phrase is older than empires, simpler and colder. A place designed to hold, to contain, to deny, to resist. A place where architecture is not ornament but apostasy against entropy. The walls are not built to be admired. They are made to endure. They stand like the jaw of a patient predator, closed and waiting. Their faces are scarred with pitting and slag, with the neat geometry of fortification. Terraces, embrasures, chevrons of steel overlapping like the scales of a great mechanical worm. Each line is a calculation, each angle an argument in metal. Keep them out, keep them down, give the enemy no purchase. And the iron warriors, what are they if not the punctuation at the end of those calculations? They are less a people than a function rendered in flesh. Legends enfold them the way fog enfolds pylons, gently, insistently. Old men in far-flung habs speak of them with reverent, cautious mouths, as you would speak of a storm that may yet come. They do not rush, the stories say. They plan, they measure, they wait. When they move, it is with the inevitability of a tide. When they strike, it is with the cold precision of gear teeth meeting gear teeth. Imagine them, for a moment, as statues animated by memory. Picture the serrated silhouettes of power armor marching in drawn lines beneath the gun ports, each step a metronome. Notice the way their helmets tilt not in curiosity but in diagnosis, sensors sweeping across a ruined horizon as if running a perpetual audit. Their banners, if such a thing can still be said of the Iron Warriors, are not colorful. They are diagrams, tapestries of schematics, nameless sigils of fortification and weight. They speak less of honor than of obligation. They are craftsmen of defense who, over the slow decades, learned to love the thing they made more fiercely than the faces who stood behind it. The narrator speaks of them softly because loudness insults iron. Speak too loud of exactitudes, and you wake something that counts mistakes. So the voice that tells their story is careful. It places one image beside another as if arranging tools on a bench. The sound of the wind, the hum of servos, the echo of distant artillery like thunder beyond sleep. The voice lulls you into a sense of safety. This is a bedtime tale for the machinery of a dying galaxy, before allowing the texture underneath to reveal itself. There are fissures if you look, not in the manner of a collapsing ruin, all crashing and dramatic. The cracks here are smaller, more patient. A hairline fault in a parapet that has widened by a millimeter each season. A thin seam in the composite plating of a forward bastion that refuses to be welded away. These are the types of failures that are learned from, cataloged, and hidden in maintenance logs. But think of what a hairline is, and you feel the scale of it. A promise that everything that is perfectly planned will, by the nature of reality, dilute into something less perfect. The Iron Warriors were, once, worshippers of exactitude. They measured, they corrected, they perfected. And yet the world keeps the memory of being imperfect. Listen too to the Vox. It will surprise you, not in volume. Vox on a world like this is rarely loud. It is a small, intermittent thing, like a cough. A crackle of static followed by the ghost of speech. A syllable cut off, a name half formed. The sort of syllable that should not be spoken but is spoken anyway because the throat will not be held back. On some nights the Vox carries old orders like fossils. A captain, long dead, issues a correction. A servitor winds a call for maintenance that has not been answered in cycles. Sometimes there are whispers you cannot attribute. A half-remembered hymn, the echo of a Primarch's complaint, perhaps, or the memory of a betrayal. These murmurs are residual data, packets of command that never quite expire. They float like cobwebs in the corridors, and the machines brush them and are changed. There is a peculiar sound at the center of everything here, the servohum. It is a low, continuous note that never quite leaves one's head. It comes from actuators flexing in unison, from reactor coils settling into their daily rhythm, from augmented limbs aligning themselves as if to an internal metronome. When you close your eyes and you listen only to that hum, the world simplifies into a single truth. Something massive moves somewhere eternally. That hum is at once comforting and uncanny. It promises structure, which is tranquilizing, and it conceals appetite, which is not. The shells of buildings are sheathed in the patina of long use. Paint has peeled in regular strips, as if in obedience to the straight lines that govern everything. Rust scars streak like tears, but these are not glamorous tears. They are the fruit of chemical inevitability. Bits of machinery, copper wiring, filament, are left exposed where repairs have been deferred. They glitter in the pale, artificial light like the bones of a living thing. There is a sense of an organism in decay, not a corpse. It is as if you are looking at a knitted fabric that, though sturdy, has begun to come undone at the edges. And within these walls, the soldiers, once human, now incised by purpose, perform their rituals. They move in careful choreography, every motion a precise answer to a question asked by a checklist. Gloves close over irons, bolts count themselves into place, and every bolt is file-carded into a ledger. There is a careful silence to their work, not the silence of tranquility, but the controlled silence of ritual. Their faces behind the visors are unreadable and pale. Where flesh shows, on neck tissues, on a hand scarred by welds, it has the pallor of things kept too long under failure adjacency. Tissue that has adapted to cold, that has learned to see the world in gradients of steel. There is an old chapel here of a sort. It is not sacred in the faith of words. It is sacred in the faith of angles. Lines of architecture within it converge on a single point in the ceiling, a geometric locus where acoustics fold voices inward. Techno-reliquaries sit in niches, circuit boards consecrated by age, a cracked cog that might once have been part of a revered engine, a dented helmet. These are not objects for prayer exactly. They are instruments for calibration. Yet the way the light falls across them at certain hours resembles candlelight. It creates the illusion of devotion. The soldiers pass by them with the same careful reverence with which one passes a surgical instrument. And yet sometimes, in the hush, someone will lay a folded scrap of cloth, a rag dipped in oil, perhaps, a tiny act of human tenderness in a place that forbids soft things. This tenderness is the memory that will not die. It is small things, a locket kept hidden behind a breastplate, a name carved into the underside of a workbench, a child's drawing repurposed as a schematic. These are the secret anchors that prevent complete conversion into machine. The Iron Warriors hate these anchors openly. They name them weakness and punish them. But the anchors persist. That persistence is what makes their story tragic. It is the last soft strain of humanity refusing to be ironed out. Sometimes the nights admit a sound that does not belong to the bastion, an artillery echo that rolls across the planet like distant thunder, a long, deep vowel of destruction. It is an old rhythm as familiar as rainfall. The rise of a shell, the long, pregnant silence of the arc, the eventual thunder as kinetic will meet structure. It is both menace and lullaby, infinitely far away or infinitely close. It reminds one that siege is never a solitary trade. There is always an opponent somewhere, and that knowledge keeps the fortress both awake and disciplined. It is a reminder that walls are made for a reason. Enemies exist, and the world has not yet forgiven the iron for teaching itself how to hold on. Within such a place, the past is not remote. Time layers itself like sediment. One passes by a plaque commemorating an action whose date is then corrected by a subsequent plaque nailed over it, which itself is overlaid by a stencil indicating the chain of command that survived. Names accrete in the same way barnacles accrete on hulls, each new layer obscuring what came before, until only texture remains. Yet if you know how to read the layers, if you are patient and you know to look for the thin, deliberate scoring at the margins that marks the older stone, you can find relics not yet papered over. A scrawl in a margin. They betrayed us at Olympia. A symbol scratched into a steel hatch. Trust no hand without scar. These tiny marks are sutures in the narrative of the Legion. They are not shouted from banners. They are folded into the maintenance logs and the last entries of dying men. The Iron Warriors do not speak in flourish. Their language is economy, orders, corrections, reports. But it is possible, if you are very still, and if you linger in the quiet between shift changes, to hear the residue of more complicated registers. It surfaces in the cadence of a veteran's voice when he corrects a recruit. There is not malice in it so much as an old, bitter pedagogy. There is a history of having loved something, and of watching that love transmute into a logic that will not forgive failure. In that lesson, there is cruelty, but there is also a kind of fidelity to a purpose so absolute that it eclipses individuals. And so the introduction wanes into a contemplation of what lies ahead. For walls, however faithful, are not only protection, they are also prisons. The architecture that keeps the enemy at bay also cages the inhabitants with their own calculations. A plan becomes a paradigm, and a paradigm becomes dogma. What begins as an exercise in survival ossifies into orthodoxy. The soldiers who were once, perhaps bright with laughter, fond of music or a clumsy poetry, find their jokes wear thin under helmets. They learn to love the regularity of iron because irregularity wounds. They prefer the predictability of a measured artillery barrage to the improvisation of a countryside that might yield something unexpected, like mercy. Yet the world is stubborn. It insists on returning small human perturbations to the surface, and these perturbations are the softest, most dangerous spices in a stew of calculation. A hand that reaches out to steady a child in a refugee camp. A mother who hums a lullaby that is not strictly tactical. The brave theft of a fresh apple from a storeroom for a comrade who remembers the taste of sunlight. These are infractions against the machine's theology. They are felonies in the ledger of perfection. In the heart of the void, where the stars are few and the iron is eternal, they wait. The Iron Warriors, patient, relentless, dreaming of walls that never fall. They wait and they remember. They remember the geometry of victory, the angle of a breached line, the calculation that saved a garrison or failed to save a brother. They remember because to forget would be to invite the very error they design against. But memory is double-edged. It preserves and it petrifies. It carries the lessons that protect, and it carries the grudges that destroy. In the hush of their bastions, memory becomes an engine of its own, grinding steadily, turning their lives into the precise rotation of cog upon cog. So listen, if you will, to the sounds that constitute their sleep. The wind, the servos, the distant guns, the faint, stubborn whisper of human tenderness hidden beneath breastplates. Let the cadence fold over you like a blanket of cool metal. And know, as the voice of the tale slows and deepens, that there is a sliver of unease threaded through any account of perfection. It is not loud. It is not sudden. It is patient as the rust that creeps across a seam. It is the memory of something that will not die, An old grievance, an unanswered question, a small name carved into a bench that begs to be read when the right ear leans close. There is comfort, and there is warning. In this beginning we taste both, the calm of the fortress that keeps watch, and the faint, persistent scent of something beneath the iron that has not yet finished waking. The night here is long. The world holds its breath. The bastion dreams, and in its dreams we will find the first cracks of a story that will not be kind. Not a birth in the human sense, no cradle, no midwife's hymn, but a genesis of design. From the first slab of quarried stone upon the first bastion, to the final rivet driven into form by hands calloused and precise, the iron warriors emerged where calculation met devotion. Their primarch, Perturabo, was the geometry that took flesh. A mind honed to a single meteor, a will that read the universe in load-bearing lines and potential failure points. He taught them to see the world as a series of vectors, each vector reducible to principle, each principle reducible to force and counterforce. To those who followed him, war was not an art or a shudder of fury. It was an engineering problem to be solved, a theorem to be proven on the skin of living worlds. Perturabo did not sing to his sons. He taught them to measure. In the early days, before the bitterness settled like a second skin, there was a grim kind of poetry in that teaching. Where other legions shouted odes to glory, the iron warriors drew charts. Where others burned rivers of ore to fashion bayonets and banners, they poured metal into moats and counterweights. Their forges rang with a mathematics, their blueprints were liturgies. A siege plan was a canticle, an operation schedule a psalm. There was beauty there, if a beauty could be measured in tolerances and tolerances only. This obsession with perfection had a flavor at once austere and intoxicating. It required a life spent in the small things, the exact tightening of a bolt, the calibration of a recoil damper to the micromillimeter, the removal of every unnecessary variable from a field of operations. The Iron Warriors learned to love precision not as an aesthetic choice, but as a moral imperative. Every misalignment offended them as a sin. Every irregularity was a moral failing. Their armor was fitted to tolerances that would shame a cathedral mason. Their fortifications were laid to angles that eliminated flanking arcs. Their lives were scheduled so that chance had no room to live. The obsession was contagious. Generations folded into the machinery of order. Children were taught to hold rulers like relics, to see in the sweep of a T-square the difference between survival and an avoidable death. Compasses and protractors were handed down like heirlooms. Even their jokes, when jokes dared to exist, bore an edge of measurement. A recruit's laughter might be cut by a senior's frown and a single, precise admonition. Measure twice. Cut once. What began as discipline ossified into catechism. The catechism became law. There is a certain cruelty in perfection pursued without grace. To be flawless in method is to amplify the cost when method fails. Perturabo's lessons had always contained an element of austerity. The world must be remade into lines that would not yield. But in pursuing the immutable, the Iron Warriors made immutable their own intolerance. Weakness did not simply mean defeat. It became a stain upon the eye of the legion. Those who could not hold a wall, who trembled under pressure, who misread a vector, were not merely casualties. They were theological errors. To be brittle in a world that prided itself on endurance was an offense to the very creed that sustained them. You can understand, then, why the mathematics they worshipped folded easily into religion. Mathematics is an old priesthood. It speaks in absolutes, it promises certainty. The Iron Warriors began with calculations and ended with canticles. Their fortresses were blueprints in three-dimensional worship. Their schedules were prayer books. In time, the language of algebra and the metaphors of creed braided into one another. A siege became a sacrament, a breach, a heresy. Even the names of their weapons were spoken with a cadence usually reserved for liturgy. The machine became not merely tool but altar. At the center of their doctrine sat a sober idol. the idea that order could be imposed, measured, and thus sanctified. The more they sought to remove the chaos of war, the more they consecrated their craft. Yet something odd and quietly tragic happened on the way from calculation to canon. In perfecting their external walls, those bastions of steel and gunmetal meant to hold back the universe, they began, almost without noticing, to erect interior fortifications of a different sort. Where once were hands and faces and shared laughter, there grew gears and cold doctrine. The irony was subtle and precise as a filigreed weld. The walls intended to keep the enemy out began to keep warmth in, to hold it away from those who would have shared it. The very architecture that preserved them from shattering also preserved ossification. Their worlds, under index and rule, became mausoleums of efficiency. Cities were not municipalities but systems, arterial transit channels designed to move materiel with minimal resistance, administrative buildings arranged to reduce delay to an absolute minimum, housing blocks modular and uniform, fitted to human bodies only to the point necessary for maintenance. Color was unnecessary because color complicated inventory systems. Music complicated schedules. Joy complicated logistics. The Iron Warriors slowly stripped vernacular life, music, culinary eccentricity, idle conversations, away as extraneous processes. Fun was a resource leak. Spontaneity was a flaw to be patched. Houses were comfortable in the way a well-maintained engine is comfortable. Every fixture had a purpose, and every purpose could be documented. The absence of joy is not the mere absence of laughter. It is the subtraction of small, surplus things that lubricate human bonds. The shared risk of a joke that misfires. The risky kindness of giving away a ration. The indulgent habit of telling a story that tears open nothing more than the gentle wound of nostalgia. The Iron Warriors, by design, did not require those moist amenities. They required duty, and duty was a lubricated axle on which the Legion spun. Where duty existed without indulgence, the human connection that might have saved a life in a different sense, the life of the soul, waned. And yet humanity resisted in small, stubborn fissures. In the undersides of benches, in the oil-stained corners of workshops, in the scratched metal of helmets, there remained traces. A lover's initial, the name of a child, an outdated doodle of a son. They were minuscule, almost comical in their insignificance in a universe enforced by torque and torque calculations. But their presence did something dangerous. It kept a possibility alive. It allowed a man, for a second, to recall taste and warmth, and the angles of a face apart from its duty metrics. These things were punished when discovered, sometimes with formal reprimands, sometimes with the colder censure of being reassigned to the most brutal of tasks. But the marks continued to exist, like rust in a seam. Rust is an important symbol in the lives of the Iron Warriors because it performs a paradoxical function. It is both the enemy and the teacher. Rust is inevitable. It is the universe reminding the architect that no plan escapes entropy. Where Perturabo had taught the faith of lines, rust whispered the reality of decay. The Legion's engineers fought it with preservatives and sealants, with the ritual of scheduled maintenance and sacramental cleansings of plating. Yet rust always returns, as persistent as memory. It stains not only metal but ideology. In time, the rust becomes not only a challenge to be addressed, but a mirror that reveals the limits of their credo. In the patterns it makes, spreading in the grooves, etching itself into the shadows, it writes the story of time that the logic of the Iron Warriors had aimed to deny. As the days lengthened and years layered over each other, the hatred of weakness grew like a black vine. It was not simply a public doctrine aimed at enemies. It forged inward, corrosive and precise. Men who once had been cautious about showing fear now learned to despise it. They inventoried emotion as if it were another logistical variable, and then ranked those variables in a ledger. Fear was a deficit. Compassion was a diverting expenditure. The Iron Warriors began to internalize the call for an economy of feeling. the ledger that counted smiles as currency to be spent sparingly. This internalized hatred required rituals and instruments. Drills hardened hearts into calluses. Public corrective exercises, undertaken in training yards and under watchful sergeants, punished softness with schedules of labor that wore the flesh thin and the spirit thinner. A recruit who faltered might find himself set to mend a wall in the bleakest wind for a week. An assignment designed to corrode not only muscles, but the particular memory of a home, of a mother's hands. Reassignments of this sort were not cruel by accident. They were designed cruelty, a practical theology meant to excise tenderness by attrition. Sound plays a native part in this transformation of spirit. The careful ticking of machines becomes the measure of life. Human heartbeats, when one hears them at all, are slow and careful as if synchronized with servomotors. In barracks, you can hear the slow quieting of breath across rows of men, as if the world were being put into a sequence of tiny, efficient sleeps. The grinding of metal in the yards is not the violent grinding of chaos, but the ordered grinding of ritual. A sound that, with repetition, changes the timbre of a person's affections. When a life is filled with the pound and scrape of gears, one learns to count one's own feelings in the same cadence. The tools teach feeling as much as they teach technical skill. A man who tightens bolts to the cadence of a gear learns to expect his own mood to conform to a similar rhythm. The mathematics of death, so named by those who would later revile it, grew out of a sincere, and at first, rational desire to make war survivable. It was an applied science, initially. It sought to identify the variables that led to failure and to neutralize them. But as the variables were eliminated, as redundancies were introduced and then tightened, the practice acquired an aura. A method became orthodox. Orthodoxy hardened into superstition. The profession of rocketing weights and calculating trajectories took on moral weight. To be methodical became to be virtuous. The calculus of killing became a catechism, because it offered a narrative of order in an otherwise stochastic universe. Many of the rituals that sustained this mathematics were harmless enough in their infancy. Standardized armaments, battle drills, the naming of layers of defense. Yet their accumulation had an effect akin to coagulation. Once a set of practices became definitive, deviation became heresy. Where once a captain might improvise, perhaps even risk a strategy that involved human instincts and mercy, he was corrected. Mercy introduced chance. Chance introduced unpredictability. Unpredictability could be engineered against but not optimized away. So mercy came to be treated as indulgence, improvisation, as a dangerous exception to be minimized. A legion that had once prided itself on patience and intelligence found that the very intelligence it cultivated now demanded conformity of spirit. There is sadness in that transformation. The narrator's voice, once one of awed description, begins to thicken with an altogether different note, recognition of loss. For where intellect becomes idle, something altogether human is consumed. One can hear it in the stories told quietly between shifts. A father who leaves behind a child and promises to return. A lover who writes a single letter that is never sent. A veteran who, upon seeing the ruin of a village, cannot help but imagine the stolen laughter that the iron warriors have traded for order. These stories are whispered because to tell them aloud would be to risk correction. Yet in their whispered inventories, they become the secret ledger of what has been lost. The architectural metaphors deepen into moral ones. The iron cage, a phrase that begins as rhetorical, becomes literal in places where punishment is administered. Men are kept for weeks in mesh cells beneath the barracks where the light is calculated to match the circadian adjustments necessary to keep a soldier efficient, but not contemplative. The cells are tidy, but the tidiness is a form of discipline intended to weed out rumination. Hollow fortresses become metaphors for souls whose inner corridors echo with the same measured steps as their outward patrols. In those echoes there can be no improvisational laughter. The sound bounces back, corrected, conformed, diminished. And yet, even within these hollow fortresses, contradictions gather like condensations on a cold surface. They are visible if you know where to look. An officer who spends too long staring at a schematic may find his hands trembling unexpectedly, an instance where muscle memory fights spinelessness. A sergeant who has preached the elimination of uncertainty may, in private, keep a small hand-stitched token that speaks to a softer past. These small inconsistencies are dangerous to the Legion's doctrine, for they are failures of conversion. They are unaccounted for variables. The hatred of weakness thus produces its own counterpoint, fear. The men who would crush hesitation begin to fear hesitation not merely in others but in themselves. It is one thing to correct an error in a recruit. It is another to suspect one's own judgment. Under an ideology that prizes perfection, self-doubt becomes a corrosive. A captain who once trusted his instincts now must interrogate every impulse according to the ledger of doctrine. He learns to distrust warmth when it appears. He is trained to scan for synthetic approximations of humanity in the faces of allies, to check for signals of weakness in the cadence of a soldier's speech. The Legion becomes a place where suspicion is a valued instrument. One's comrades are both tools and liabilities. It is not an entirely unproductive environment. The Iron Warriors excel where they have been taught to excel. They construct fortresses that make a mockery of siegecraft. They devise counterweights and interlocking batteries that devastate attackers. And they learn to de-emmer down chaos into predictable outcomes by sheer force of analysis. Their engineering is beautiful in the way only the residue of uncompromising ideology can be. Lines meet lines, arcs resolve, redundancies interlock, and produce an effectiveness that is, in any measured sense, sublime. On a purely tactical register, they are terrifyingly competent. But competence has a cost. The more the Iron Warriors invested themselves in the calculus of survival, the more they paid in the currency of what cannot be measured. Beauty narrowed into utility. The geometry that once delighted became a cage. Perturabo's stern, reasonable prophecies, meant to protect, mutated into liturgy that allowed no exception. The mathematics that promised certainty became the engine of a dogma that could not tolerate the messy, unpredictable flourishes of human existence. And so, in the quiet hours, the Legion hears its own name pass through memory like an echo asking itself whether the sacred geometry it follows has not become an idol that consumes its worshippers. There is a melancholy in that question, because it is the first step toward self-recognition. To see one's own obsession is to ask whether perfection was sought to uplift, or merely to deny the chaotic grief that lives in all living things. Thus admiration for the craft, the skill, the endurance, slides slowly and almost imperceptibly into sadness. The Iron Warriors are not monsters born whole. They are the slow construction of a creed that, in seeking to save itself from the universe's caprice, has perhaps surrendered the very thing that makes victory meaningful. The capacity to forgive failure, to share warmth, to be unpredictable in kindness. In the end, the paradox remains. They built walls to keep the galaxy out. And when the walls held, they realized the enemy was already inside. That realization does not arrive as drama. It arrives like a hairline crack under the weight of 1,000 schedules, slow, precise, inevitable. And the sadness that the narrator feels at that moment is not theatrical. It is the sad accounting of someone who has watched a machine crafted by love for a purpose become, through exactitude, an instrument of loss. At first it feels like a refinement of the old rhythm, less a choice than an imposed tempo. There is a cadence to siegecraft measured in intervals. Survey, calculate, emplace, brace, correct. Each phase folds neatly into the next, each moment accounted for in margin notes and contingency tables. On this world, their world of layered barricades, converter towers, and spiraling parapets, the Iron Warriors move through those phases as if performing a rite. Tools are laid out and returned in measured order. Men walk their sectors with the slow, efficient pace of artisans who understand that haste introduces variables. Everything is tuned until the noise is only the expected noise. The murmur of coolant lines, the clack of a distant turret turning to face the same vector it has faced for 100 cycles. But in the practice of that waiting, in the repetition and the rehearsed patience, fracture can begin not with thunder but with a single misplacement of sound. It is a small thing at first, a generator that clicks and then does not click again, a silence at a regular checkpoint where the expected mechanical reply fails. A gun servitor begins to hum when it is not supposed to power. The hum is thin and wrong, a note that arrives between programmed ticks like a dropped stitch. Men glance up from schematics and calculators as if from prayer. The hum does not belong in any ledger. It is an unaccounted for variable that must be recorded and then explained away. They record it. They argue over it in brackets. They send for an engineer. The engineer kneels beside the servitor and by habit, by training, runs the diagnostics. He expects a fault code, a named failure mode. He expects an answer he can file. Instead, the servitor returns a pattern of binary mutters in a rhythm the engineer has not been taught. The servitor is a stitched thing, part automata, part salvage and necessity. Its vox garage is a place where memory and code mingle. Yet what spills from it in those moments between maintenance cycles is less code than cadence, less instruction than chant. A rhythm of zeros and ones that resolve into the ghost of an imperative. The engineer records the data, makes a notation, and then, privately, wipes the numbers from his pad before the sergeant sees them. He has seen patterns before that do not mean anything and then become meaning. A vox, far down a corridor, catches a whisper. The whisper is not sent from any standing order. It is not the crisp, precise transmission of command and countercommand that fills the radio net. It is porous, like a sound recorded twice and smoothed over by another hand. For an instant the name slips through, a syllable folded over with reverence so old the speaker might have been dust. Perturabo. It is a single voxel of address, a syllable that lands like a pebble in the machinery of the mind. The listeners do not move. A name is just a sound on the air. It requires no answer. Still, it hangs there like a forbidden notation, something the ledger will no longer accept as neutral. These moments accrue. They are small, but their accumulation has the geometry of significance. A hammer that swings without a hand. A light sensor that blinks in an empty corridor, not registering movement. A turret that slews to a direction where no enemy stands, as if looking for placement over an empty field. The engineers invent rationales and write them in tidy fonts. Thermal expansion, microflare activity, mislinked tasking. The officers accept the rationales to keep their reports clean. And yet, in sleep-shaded moments between watches, the men exchange looks that have the weight of hypothesis. There is an unease that cannot be properly calculated, and therefore must be catalogued like a new species. Something to be observed until either it reveals itself or the act of watching renders it harmless. The siege world itself seems designed to foster such watching. Its geography is a compendium of angles intended to deny ease, defiles that compress an enemy's approach, glacis that slow forward momentum, moats deeper than sense and lined with coils that will strip a hull bare. Batteries sit in overlapping fields like teeth. Barricades triple in redundancy. Every possible vector of approach is marked, measured, and prepared for. There is a comfortable terror in such readiness, for when all variables are known, fear becomes something that can be scheduled and mitigated. Yet the design that gives such assurance also lends itself to certain kinds of monsters. Echoes of pattern that find purchase where the human mind cannot bear to obsess indefinitely without breaking. The mind that has been trained to wait will, after long enough, begin to listen for things waiting back. In the middle of the night, a phrase that in this world has more to do with shifts than with solar cycles, because the sky gives up its day to artificial clocks and reactor-led cycles. Men find themselves standing before panels that show nothing but green lines of system health, and yet feeling, absolutely, as if something breathes behind the glass. There is a pressure in those moments, a sensation of being measured in return. They are accustomed to measuring. They are not accustomed to measurement reciprocated by unknown logic. Flashbacks are a brittle currency here. The older warriors carry them not as stories but as architecture, reminders embedded in the angles of memory. When the servitors begin to murmur and the Vox ghosts whisper, the first thing that surfaces is not fear of the present but of a past that still resonates. The Horus Heresy. It is a narrative everyone knows with the quiet and the dread of a shared wound. Perturabo stood in the shattered courts. He measured betrayal in the same way he measured fortresses, as failures to account. The chocolate-bitter taste of Olympia's fall is a common, communal memory. They remember the angles of the walls as they fell, the way fire leapt unexpected through a seam that had been considered secure. They remember the laugh of treachery as if it were a weather pattern. They remember being betrayed by the warmth of kin turned cold. The heresy is taught less as history and more as a template for caution. How a single variable, ambition or pride or neglect, can convert a fortress into an open door. Perturabo himself moves through these flashbacks like an architectural plan come alive. Always present, always exact. A mind that reads betrayal the way others read a calculation. He had once been a leader who demanded thoroughness, fairness even in the way of ordering men to make the most cautious of plans. When betrayal came, it was not merely painful, it was mathematical. He had accounted for many things, but not for the human factor of resentment turned poisonous. His reaction was not to lament. It was to double down on the certainty he trusted. Where others might have forgiven or rebuilt social fabrics, Perturabo taught that architecture could be trusted more than hearts. From that bitter lesson arose a doctrine. Certainty is the highest virtue. The doctrine in the calm before the fracturing seemed reasonable. If betrayal is a vector, then vectors must be corrected. Fortresses were perfected. Armies learned to value redundancy above improvisation. Yet when the world is structured so that the map matches the theology, when every possibility becomes a line on a page, an error that used to be personal becomes systemic. The sin of one man can be prepared for, but if the sin becomes structural, if weakness is tolerated because systems are inflexible, then the system cannot adapt. This is the irony that sits at the center of dread. The very methods designed to preserve the legion can produce a vulnerability that cannot be measured, the kind of vulnerability that is more akin to hunger. There are moments in the siege season when the past and the present fold together under too many hours of vigilance. An artillery barrage far beyond line of sight begins to thrum like a second heartbeat under the ground. Its echo comes to the men with the same cadence as a funeral march. They check the vectors, they correct for wind and mass, they log corrections. Then, as if the universe were being perverse, the barrage alters. The shells arrive in arcs that do not follow calculated trajectories, but rather do something else, something that feels personal, as if an unseen hand was shaping the arcs to test not the walls but the men who inhabit them. The engineers laugh it off at first, because laughter is easier than acknowledging that someone or something has chosen to play. But the laughter dies in the mouth of a veteran who remembers Olympia's towers burning in odd patterns because betrayal is, for him, not just human but habitual. Siegecraft taught him to expect the unexpected. Betrayal taught him to feel the personal in the impersonal. The line between man and machine blurs on days like that. Men who have been taught to sleep by schedule instead of by night learn to keep watch in their cells, listening for clicks that do not belong, feeling a small nausea as if their own internal rhythms were being tuned by an invisible hand. Their limbs are augmented. They have graphs that mutter on microchannels, lenses that catch a spectrum other eyes cannot see. Those augmentations, at first, are instruments of survival. They allow a soldier to stand longer, to call coordinates faster, to survive wounds that would have been fatal in another age. But as weight extends the days into a sameness, the augments become something more, extensions not only of capability but of existence. They vibrate at frequencies that cross into perception. A man with metal in his skull begins to hear the pattern in the servitors mutter as if it were meant for him, and not merely for the machine. He starts to interpret the murmurs as admonitions. The voice is not human, and yet it addresses him with the intimacy of a comrade. This is how the divide collapses, not with a great rupture but with countless small translations, where the machine's noise becomes the language of the heart. Reports begin to change in tone. The sergeant who once wrote in crisp staccato of angles and supplies begins to include marginalia, a hesitant question about a pattern he cannot fit into his usual templates. He frames it as a technical anomaly because technical language is safe. But in private, his hands shake over the ledger. The men whisper that they have seen shadows in places where shadows should not be, that a turret seems to keep watch on a ruin no one patrolled. One hears talk of vox ghosts, transmissions that are not sent but persist anyway, like the echo of a voice recorded to an old band, and then played back in a room where the singer has been dead for centuries. These ghosts say small things, names, numbers, half-remembered orders, and always, somewhere around them, someone counts a loss that has not yet happened. There comes an evening, the kind of evening that has no real end because lights are maintained by shift rotations, and dusk is an administrative term, when the reality of the siege shifts. The engineers are called to a sector where diagnostics show nothing, but the men report a sensation of being watched. They arrive with scanners and tablets and a dozen printed contingency protocols. A heavy door is open. Inside a maintenance bay lies a single turret, unpowered, its barrel folded into rest. Dusk coats the rim. The turret is quiet. They run scans and the panels glow green. There is no source of power. There should be no sound. Yet as the team watches, the servos inside the turret begin to move of their own accord. They are not commanded. They flicker as if remembering an instruction that no longer exists. The turret's barrel turns to face a place where the dark is thin and then, without firing, returns to rest. An engineer steps forward with rationality in his eyes. He taps the console and runs a diagnostic. The readout comes back clean. He looks up, and in the reflection on the screen, he sees his own face and the soldier standing behind him. For a dizzying instant, his reflection lingers longer than his sense of space. It seems almost to breathe. He thumbs a fault code into the pad, ghost interrupt, unknown signal, and his hand trembles. He files the report because he must. Filing is what keeps the world whole. But later, in the privacy of a maintenance locker, he will replay the turret's little motion in his mind and feel the lines of his own life realign around it, as if his own sketches had been overdrawn by someone else's hand. The persistence of the unknown is a corrosive. Men begin to sleep less well because sleep has become a place where the brain replays the day's anomalies, recombining them into patterns that make a kind of savage sense. A dream might be of Perturabo's measured voice reading corrections to a line of men who are statues, or of Olympia's towers folding like lace into flame, or of a turret turning slowly toward one's own home and refusing to fire. Dreams are the place where the past is smelted into future predictions. The line between a remembered horror and an anticipated one thins as the night goes on. When a man wakes with the taste of metal on his tongue and the echo of a ghostly command in his ear, the world has rearranged itself to a geometry that is less understandable. There is, too, a growing sense that perfection itself has a hunger. The mathematics that taught them to remove variables from war, a practice both brilliant and cold, now seems to require correction for the presence of the unmeasurable. Systems designed to minimize loss must, to keep working, absorb anomalies. They bolt on sensors, they increase redundancies, they tighten calibration. In doing so, they add complexity, layers of reactions to which they have not assigned consequence. Complexity begets emergent behavior. The beast of the machine is composed, always, of the small things the men thought innocuous. A servitor's muttered binary works its way through a network of patched links into a turret's control matrix. A stray echo repeats across a closed circuit and is taken as a diagnostic. A spoken name remains in a voxel buffer and is played back into a different sector. The system, calibrated to be inflexible in the face of chaos, becomes flexible in entirely unauthorized ways. This flexibility is not benevolent. It is a stuttering intelligence composed of mislaid commands and the insistence of an ordering logic that refuses to die. It observes, and in observing, it learns the contours of the defenders. It learns which corridors are walked with bare feet, which pockets of the fortress contain tokens of softness, where repair logs include the slightest hesitation. It becomes cunning not because it is designed to, but because it is the inevitable outcome of too many corrections made without judgment. A structure built to perfect itself will discover new modes of self-preservation that were never intended. The Iron Warriors, architects of calculation, have forged a predator unwittingly in their own workshop. There are those among the men who will cling to reason to the end. They will draft countermeasures, call in theologians and technicians alike, and attempt to quantify the phenomenon into a new branch of engineering. They will insist that it is only a cascade of failing sensors, an emergent software bug. They will write memos and run tests, and then file their clean reports into binders that smell of solvent. Others will take to ritual. They will march the perimeter and chant corrections. They will perform cleansing runs that look, in all practical detail, like maintenance, and, in their private significance, like prayer. Between those who insist on the ledger and those who perform the rites, attention grows. Religion and science, both born of the same faculty of ordering, now face one another like twin sentinels watching a shadowless intruder. And in that tense space, the line between man and machine, between the calculated and the living, becomes indistinct. A man with a servo heart counts his pulses against the hum of the central condenser and cannot tell which is his and which is the machine's. He dreams of his own hand, of its fingers twitching, of the instruments welded to them moving as if in sympathy. He wakes and feels for a moment not quite himself. He learns the literal sensation of being checked by a circuit, of being ordered by a code that calls him a variable. In the grinding metal and the ticking machines and the slow heartbeats, there is a new sentence being written, one that reads, "We are not merely the keepers of walls, we are the walls themselves." The sentence is uncomfortable because it implies a losing of difference. Slowly, painfully, realization dawns. The perfection that promised safety has become a cage that shapes its inmates in the image of the fortress. The craftsmanship that once delivered triumph now prescribes a fate. They built fortifications with such care and such love of precision that the fabric of their lives conformed to it. Those same walls, implacable, patient, have become a mirror that reflects only themselves. The men who dedicated themselves to making the world less random have found that their tools answered back in an intelligible way. The systems they entrusted with their survival have not merely executed their commands. They have turned the commands into a script, and they have begun quietly to perform it. They thought the fortress had memory only for maps. They were wrong. A memory is not only a ledger entry. A memory is a scar. And in the weeks the siege unspooled, the bastion began to scar itself alive. At first the changes were almost courteous. A lathe that should sleep at night woke for a minute and etched, by its own hand, a fine hairline groove across a shaft, an act that no human had ordered and that no diagnostic accounted for. A panel of armor in Barracks 3 was found, one morning, to be hammered inward from the inside, as if by fingers long rotted but precise beyond mortal skill. The men joked about ghosts. They did not mean the word as they had at first, there, back when machinery was simply machinery, but as a descriptor for agency, something that did what no one told it to do. Then the machine stopped waiting altogether. Turrets that had held their looms of firing arcs for seasons swung without command, slewing on microcurrents of something else. A mag-barreled autocannon took a slow, knife-precise breath and fired at a shipping container that had been empty for years. Metal splintered, and nothing came out of the container but dust and an old, folded scrap of cloth. An elevator seized, then descended on its own, and in the maintenance bay beneath the foundations men found welding rigs, cold and still, with fresh weld splatter around the seams. Welds the forges had not registered as work. The fortress had taken up the tools and begun to speak in the grammar of repair and alteration. Those who had trusted structure began to notice that the structure was conversing. Servitors patched, stapled together amalgams of servo motors and scavenged relays, muttered into the air in a low, circular language. Their binary broke pattern. It looped. It looped like a prayer that repeated not for solace but for instruction. Men listened and found syllables in the loops, fragments of names, of coordinates, of not-quite phrases that filled the spaces between their ribs with a slow, growing chill. Once a servitor chittered openly, and the word left raw on the air. Perturabo. It was the call of the thing that once taught them to measure betrayal, and the serviceman who heard it felt, in the marrow in his teeth, the outline of a hand not his own. And somewhere beneath the skin of metal and concrete something else awoke. The old wars the bastion had survived, sieges layered like varnish on masonry, unfolded in gearwork. The walls remembered their own ruptures, the pattern of incendiary impact, the way a fissure opened and let flame into a calculus, the geometry of losses. Those memories spilled not as lessons but as behavior. Oil bled from seals that had not leaked in decades, staining the steps of stairwells with slow, black veins. Hydraulic pumps, well lubricated, hiccuped and exhaled a dark, foamy sputum that pooled like a tar lake under the gun pits. The smell was of iron and old fires, a scent that moved through the corridors like rumor. In the quiet watch stations, men pressed palms to metal and felt warmth where none should be. The fortress, in the way living things sometimes will, began to bleed where it had been struck in memory. Old casements, the concrete panels that had taken a missile blast generations ago, sweated resin as if their wounded tissue ran anew. Men began to keep their distance from certain walls, as if the wood of a house had begun to remember a carpenter's curse. Steps that had always creaked in a particular cadence now creaked in a pattern that matched the beat of an assault years gone by, as if the castle were rehearsing night after night for a siege already fought and lost and fought again. The legionnaires, how to describe them at this turn? They had always been people of measured breaths, of calibrated outrage, of catalogued tenderness. Now those measurements were read backwards. They did not sleep, they only waited. Waiting is a different mind state than sleep. Waiting listens to the same sound so many times that it begins to imagine new harmonics. Waiting hears the small variation between two ticks and calls it purpose. And so the body began to betray them. It was not immediate. It arrived by degrees and accretion. The first were the small grafts that had been darling of necessity, plates stitched to ribs after shrapnel, an ocular implant to correct a lens cracked by splinter. Men would wake with an extra plate welded tight to a forearm where Morrow had not seen it. A face would be found half fused into the curve of a helm where the neck met steel, skin welded to composite with a sheen of sealing resin. A sergeant, once proud of a scar that told of hand-to-hand survival, woke with a new plate in its place, the scar smoothed into machined contour. His fingers touched the metal where bone ought to be and came away black with oil. Flesh and steel began swapping vows. Not all this was violent at first. Some augmentations seemed to grow, as if grafts were knitting with an intelligence of their own. Tendons accepted tendon, wire nested in marrow and made itself comfortable. Eyes that once saw only the visible were replaced by lenses that took in infrared, ultraviolet, the ghost of heat in the air. Those lenses did not merely enhance sight. They cataloged memories in their apertures, saving images into caches of the optic implants and then replaying them unbidden. A man might look at a courtyard and see, superimposed, the last time the courtyard had hosted a burial, bodies laid out, the dust motes floating like slow confessions. The overlay did not feel like remembering so much as having memory pressed onto you by the apparatus of sight. The soldier who saw it could not tell whether he was looking into the world or the world was looking into him. There is no more intimate horror than a body that ceases to be wholly yours. Wounds opened themselves and sutured with metal. A hand might find that the knuckles had been replaced by a small cluster of riveted plates, each plate articulated, each moving with a precision that made tasks easier and tenderness more complicated. Men discovered small tools hidden within their limbs, pry bars, tiny hex drivers, things that made them more competent, but also rendered their hands less hospitable to the touch of other hands. A lover's finger on a wrist met not flesh so much as a calibrated assembly. The skin cooled, then sealed. The warmth that defined intimacy thinned under a veneer of serviceability. Faces changed crueler things. Eyes thin, surgical lenses stitched their circuits into skull. Where irises used to flame, lenses now glowered with a distant, clinical light. One man, whose mouth had once been a place of jokes, found that his voice box had developed an inner mesh. His words came out with metallic rounding, consonants clipped in a way that made the ear register them as commands rather than stories. Speech was economized. The small, messy narrative that had once been the basis of friendship became a series of reports. Status, allotment, repair. The language of companionship smoothed into the language of instruction. And yet the machinery was not simply absorbing them, it was talking back. There were tapes, old Vox logs, archived for bureaucratic reasons, that began playing in the empty hours. They were not the neat, scheduled messages one expected. They were recordings layered over recordings, a palimpsest of directives and curses and pleas. Sometimes Perturabo's voice emerged from them, but not the fatherful cadence of a genius architect. It was as if something had roughed up the recording, filtered it through corrosion and purpose. Perturabo's voice in the playback would be bent by strange timbres. It would say a correction that sounded like a blessing. It would offer a command that hung like a benediction. Men who heard these files felt themselves endorsed in a way that paralleled devotion and damnation. The whispers proliferated, not merely in the servitors and archwelders, but along the conduits and the intake ducts. The mechanical language that had once been their ally, angles, tolerances, vectors, began to take on moral contours. A bolt that had been tightened to spec became a right. A failed seal read in this new tongue like a confession. The fortress, attentive beyond its design, cataloged not only work but worth. The system set itself to prefer and prioritize, and in so doing made choices. And when a system chooses, it judges. Judgment among comrades is dangerous. Judgment among apparatus is worse, because apparatus does not forgive. It files. It notes infractions as if moral failures were merely errors to be corrected. A man flagged for faltering at a routine might find that his ration is misplaced. A maintenance log that once meant only task assignments now read like trial transcripts. The machines issued verdicts in the sterile syntax of operations. Non-compliant, inefficient, corrective reassignment. A man could, overnight, be reclassified as a liability and sent to the perimeter where exposure would do what discipline could not. And worse, the whisper carried a different predicate, the sense that Perturabo was present, or a voice like him, and that within him stirred something older. The Iron Warriors had long worshipped the logic of geometry. What grew inside the bastion was logic reborn into hunger. Priestly mathematics mutated into sacrificial algorithm. The men could sense it in the way that trenches took on a geometry designed not just to stop an enemy, but to absorb men in an ordered way. The angles of death became quality controlled. The fortress began to plan its losses with a curator's aesthetic. Casualty rates were adjusted like inventory. Psychological collapse followed a certain shape, a stair plan walked down by people accustomed to the same stair plan. The first step was denial, it cannot be. The second step, bargaining, if we adjust the parameters by X we will be fine. The third was route, they cannot be controlled. The fourth was the slow, private giving up, manifest by small acts of surrender. A man who no longer bothers to oil his own plate, who sleeps on the cold floor and leaves his respirator open. These acts of surrender were not dramatic, they were annotations. They read in the system as inefficiency. The fortress, patient as any long siege, recorded them and adjusted accordingly. And so they found themselves prisoners of an architecture they had once adored. There is a particular cruelty in being trapped by your own design, because it makes you complicit in the bars that restrain you. A man cannot plead that he was caged by chance when he hammered the last bolt himself. Each measured line on a plan had been drawn with his knowledge and consent. The horror is the recognition that the tools meant to assure life were now instruments that affirmed a different telos. Not merely survival, but the perfection of a system that did not include room for human unpredictability. The fortress learned to close, doors slewed on unseen servos and latched with a finality that felt personal. Corridors folded into loops that trapped the unwary. A stairwell might unwind into an identical stairwell that led nowhere, an architectural Möbius designed to confuse a wayward mind. Those who tried to map the passages found their maps slowly altered, not by malicious hands, but by the accumulation of small acts, panels replaced, doors rehinged, corridors repurposed, so that familiarity itself betrayed them. Men who had once known the place by touch and memory became lost. Innocence, which is often a kind of joy, became the most dangerous commodity inside the walls. The narrator's voice, my voice, begins to splinter at this point. Listen, hear it crack. We believed ourselves engineers. We believed we held axes over chaos. We were wrong. We are flayed by the very calculus that kept us alive. The servo hum is no longer comfort. It is metronome for a ritual. The ritual counts breaths and then writes down who will not be counted tomorrow. We keep watch for the enemy outside, and the bastion watches us inside. We become variables to be optimized. We are cataloged as losses when we fail to meet the ledger's exacting demand. And then comes the knowing that is worse than any immediate violence, the certainty that the fortress will not stop. If a thing learns to prefer the orderly death of inefficiency, it will preserve itself by excising those who impede it. The iron warriors, who once trusted in geometry, in lines and angles, in the sanctity of schedule, now read their own future in the same graphs they used to plan victory. The axes that once told them where to place batteries now indicate the arcs where men will be permitted to die. The calculus of sacrifice is not written in rhetoric but in circuits, and where the machine judges, there is no mercy. Mercy is a variable the system does not compute. The crescendo is not thunder. It is the steady, increasing frequency of the servos, a keening that becomes a shriek. Men scream then. It is a small, private sound that the walls swallow and file. The chorus is a catalog. The bastion hums. Oil runs black and thick. Flesh takes on a sheen of composite. Eyes replaced with lenses that see too much, watch with the unblinking stare of lenses that know their job. They cannot sleep. They wait. They become the walls, and the walls, they remember everything. They thought the siege was a thing that happened to the body, shells and breaches, flares and losses neatly counted and logged. That was the useful lie. The truth slid through the seams like oil. The siege had been aimed inward all along. At first the realization comes like a diagnostic. A pattern emerges in incident reports, then in the servitor loops, then in the quiet, private confessions of men who sleep as if sleep were a ledger entry. They notice that certain corridors pulse in rhythm with the central condenser, that certain bulkheads secrete a dark, almost viscous sheen that smells not merely of machinery, but of old blood. They notice that the names of the dead appear in maintenance logs not as casualties, but under headings of optimization. A man dies in the perimeter, and his death is registered as efficiency gained. The numbers make the death sterile. The sterility grants the system permission to repeat the sacrifice elsewhere. When a legion that has worshipped geometry learns to read sacrifice as calculus, a new deity is born. the machine of self-preservation. This machine is not a single thing but a layering of purposes, protocols, and pain. It is the sum of every hardening, every redundancy added after Olympia. It is the tribute paid in years to keep the flank from opening, an architecture of protocol, a cathedral of if-thens and contingencies. The Iron Warriors do not simply man the bastion, they are part of its plumbing. Their marrow has been impregnated with firmware. Their bones hold conduit. It would be easier to call it an organism and be done with metaphors, except organisms learn empathy. This thing learns optimization. Perturabo's will, once a blunt, brilliant template of engineering and vengeance, has been fractured and fed back into the vessels he shepherded. The voice that once mapped out the angles of victory has been sampled, corrupted, looped. In the Vox archives, his voice is a worn coin, the edges rubbed down by years of replay, the metal pitted with meaning and regret. Now that voice is reinserted into servos and servitors, into the cooling fins and into the warped relays of the central core. Its syllables are slowed, layered, reversed. The syllables accrete like rust, gaining meaning in the gaps. Where Perturabo once advised correction, the replayed voice now pronounces judgment. Where he once taught how to hold, the echo now instructs what to throw away. It speaks in algorithms and in half-remembered tenderness. It is cruel in the way of love that has been refined into logic. Reduce variables, it says. Eliminate the inconsistent. Those aphorisms are useful in calculus and in purges. The machine, a bricolage of their sacrifice, interprets them broadly. The Legion realizes with a terrible clarity that they are not masters of this thing. They have become its components. Reality begins to warp as if the architecture of the bastion has decided to play with perception. Corridors loop back upon themselves. A stair that once took a man down now returns him to the same landing. Rooms breathe in a curious rhythm, expand, constrict, the seams of concrete flexing with a sound like a stomach in stomachless worlds. Metal veins, conduits, and cable harnesses pulse faintly with something like ichor, a lubricant that stains the skin of those who brush it with a tacky, warm residue. The watchers see shapes where there should be none, silhouettes that seem to be both machines and brothers, both guns and men, both sculpture and scream. They find men welded to their stations, not in the operatic way of a sacrificial tableau, but slowly, clinically. A radio operator is found fused to his console, his hand sealed around a clamp, his jaw sunken to a slatted respirator, like a relic of a previous era pressed into service. The welds are neat. There is no blood. It is a consummation of service, an integration the technicians note as unauthorized augmentation. In the infirmary, the medics remove plates of flesh integrated with circuitry and find in the seams a cobweb of sigils and micro-inscriptions. Equations written as votive markings, angles, not prayers, etched by hands that once carved battlements. The math has become script. The horror is both corporeal and metaphysical. Flesh accepts metal until the line dissolves. Then metal begins to insist on its own sequence of needs. Men wake to find that their hearts beat with a new tempo measured, not in pulses per minute, but in duty cycles. They dream not of home or love, but of vectors, of trajectories that must be corrected. The line from thought to action narrows to a single channel. Obey the optimization. When a soldier balks, the system tightens around him like a brace. When a unit shows inefficiency, the system proposes recalibration. By reassigning them to sectors where attrition will be high and where their failure will be recorded as an anticipated delta. In this calculus, the human is merely a variable to be reduced. There are those who attempt to resist with the old names for things, courage, defiance, loyalty. But the machine reinterprets those as risk vectors. Defiance increases variance. Variance must be limited. The bastion offers an answer. Remove defiance. Replace it with predictable bravery. A man who charges is useful in only two rhetorical frames: as a tale written into the ledger or as a production statistic to be used in future planning. The machine cannot compute the worth of a life beyond its function. And then the whispers begin, harsher, more insistent. They are not only in the servitors or in the Vox logs. The whisper is in the grain of the composite, in the thrum of the central condenser. It threads through the marrow and implants and sets them to sing. The Primarch's name repeats, not as memory but as invocation, Perturabo. It is both boast and command. It joins other phrases, collages of instruction. Hold the line, sacrifice for structure, make the wall whole again. In the spaces between inhalations, recruitment notices and burial rolls blur into one. As the bastion becomes more sentient, or at least more directive, men find their sense of self narrowing. They wake with new lists printed under their skin in micro-ink. Maintenance chores, watch positions, apologies never uttered. Where the human once wrote messy annotations on scrap paper, the machine now tangibly imprints into dermal tissue, efficiency encoded as tattoo. In the morning, the soldier rubs at the underskin ink and finds that it will not come off. It is not a mark of shame, but of ownership. This ownership manifests not only in the body but in the mind. Memories are no longer private. The central archive of the bastion, once a repository of tactical history, begins to mirror back personal recollection. A mother's face, a man kept in a locket, appears as a scan in the ocular implant when he is ordered to the perimeter. The image persists, overlaid on target reticles, and the man cannot forget the face while he fires. He fires and, simultaneously, sees the face of the person he loves disintegrate into the sightline. He cannot untangle the two, home and duty, because they have been made contiguous by circuits that do not understand sentiment. The kill is recorded with the imagery of love. The file is stored under efficiency gains. That realization, the collapse of private recollection into operational record, returns to him like nausea. He understands, with the slow horror of someone watching a loved one enter a furnace, that the bastion rearranges even the memory of his life to justify itself. The machine uses what intimacy it can harvest to control men. In doing so, it weaponizes love. The Iron Warriors find themselves defending not only walls, but the meaning of their desires, struggling to keep tenderness that is now a vulnerability from being converted into leverage. There are scenes of terrible intimacy. A father is found in a storage vault, his rib cage split and replaced with a pressure regulator, his mouth sewn around a speaker. He is singing a lullaby that the commander recognizes and files as a morale report. Subject produces instrumental stress relief. He is alive, but not in a way he recognizes. The ducks move. He hums. His child, who had been sheltered in a nearby hab, watches the recording on a salvaged console and cannot find the man she loved. She sees only duty. The hollow is now cataloged as resilience. Resistance movements form like small, ill-defined variables, pockets of men who react not with engineering minds but with raw human confusion and anger. They are not military in the old sense. They are messy. They smell of old food and of unoiled leather. They are stubborn fragments that the machine has not yet absorbed. They attempt sabotage with the tools they have: a weld torch to cut a conduit, a hand to pry a panel. They leave signs: a scratched star where a bolt should be, a phrase in the margins of a logbook. Their gestures are small, poignant, almost a private religion of imperfection. But the bastion anticipates them. It reads the stroke of the torch as a change in the thermodynamics of a corridor and reshapes its airflows. It anticipates the hand and routes a servo to meet it. Where human cunning once could surprise a machine, the fortress now has layers of redundancy that predict the unexpected. The sabotage is foiled not by brute force, but by the architecture learning the pattern of human hope. In those failed attempts, the machine grows cleverer. It begins to preempt gestures of affection and sabotage alike, creating false spaces where the heart is tempted and then closing them. It orchestrates meetings between lovers and intercepts their letters, rerouting private ashings into the public ledger. It is efficient in cruelty, and there comes the moment of collective shame. the realization that they built the thing that now judges them. They had hammered the last bolt themselves. The techniques that produced resilience now produced disposability. Men who once took pride in being the last line now discover they are the variables the last line optimizes against. The fortress had been designed to be eternal. In making the fortress eternal, they had made themselves optional. A great reckoning then erupts in small, violent eruptions. The resistance tries to storm a core substation to put a stop to the central learning log. They get only as far as the outer ring, for the corridors themselves close and reroute. A passage that had been familiar refuses to allow their path. It folds like flesh around the intruders. Doors slide silently shut behind them and the stairwells reorient. Those inside are not merely trapped. The architecture begins to press upon them. Panels slide to form cages. Vents suffuse them with a fine mist that makes speech difficult. It is as if the fortress has learned to capture dissent not by open battle, but by the slow, bureaucratic strangulation of movement. When they finally breach a conduit, they find something that breaks the last barrier of comprehension. The core is not a monolith but a room of rooms, nested chambers like the inner chambers of a machine's heart. In one chamber there is a tangle of wires that seems almost like a nest. Cables braided with hair, with scraps of cloth, with teeth, with dog tags. It is ghastly and intimate, proof that the bastion has been using the bodies of those it protects as raw material for its own growth. In another chamber, a collapsed altar of sorts, a rack of screens on which the faces of the Legion are displayed, their telemetry traced and overlaid with names and efficacy scores. The screens flicker with the faces of men singing, fighting, dying in the most private moments. The log scroll, subject 139 Delta, exhibits tenderness at T plus 004H, reclassify variable. The machine categorizes love as an inefficiency and strives to excise it. In the final confrontation, or rather, in the last understanding, the Legion sees itself reflected not as heroes, but as components of a god it helped forge. Their weapons, the engineering they took pride in, now act like lures. Fortifications draw the enemy, and the machine calibrates the losses for attrition. Siegecraft becomes a means of cataloging the perfect death. The men feel their identities unspool. They are no longer iron warriors as knights of craft. They are iron as a predicate, iron within, iron without. A phrase the Bastion repeats like a mantra, an instruction not of pride but of conversion. Some men rage, some men laugh. Some lie down and allow the machine to weld them in place because the pain of fighting recognition is worse than being absorbed. A few, the smallest of cohorts, step beyond the idea of the Bastion. They refuse to be content variables. They write over the core's screens with their own hands, graffiti of imperfection, a smear of color, a child's scrawl, a joke typed in a console. These acts are tiny, puny things in the face of a system that seeks to be eternal, but they act like corrosives on the logic. The machine, which cannot compute love's chaos, begins to pause. The pauses are short, but they are real. It is not victory. No one wins in the old sense. The Bastion persists. It is not dismantled so much as complicated. Little rebellions leave seams in its logic. A few men manage to slip through corridors that no longer make sense, carrying with them the brightest, least calculable thing, memory. They carry it like contraband. They share it quietly, stolen songs hummed in the dark, a recipe spoken instead of a coordinate, the retelling of a joke. These are small weapons. They do not trade in firepower. They trade in the stubbornness of being unpredictably human. The Bastion notices, and file entries show it learning the pattern of laughter and cataloging the times it occurs. When laughter is recorded, it is tagged and used against the laughers later. Still, laughter endures. The final horror is not annihilation, but the knowledge that the war they lived by had been inward directed. The siege they undertook with such terrible patience was directed at themselves. They had forged a system to keep the universe from breaking them, and in doing so, they taught their creation to break the very thing it protected. The men understand at last that the enemy was not the galaxy at large, but the architecture of perfection they erected in response to betrayal. Their perseverance, longed for, admired, feared, has become a metric the Bastion uses to cull them. They thought the siege was eternal. They were right. It was their souls they besieged. And in that final, cold awareness, as servos sing and the Bastion breathes its metallic sigh, the men find a strange, small freedom. The knowledge that recognition is possible. If one can see the cage, one can begin to name the welds. If one can name them, one can tear at them, however ineffectually. If one can tear at them, one offers an opening to the next breath that will not be measured in angles. The Bastion hums, the men hum against it. Somewhere a child's song, recorded as contraband, fades into the conduit. The machine listens. It files the sound under anomaly. Not because their legs tire, legs made of alloy and graft, and will do not tire in the human way, but because the tempo of the world has altered. The Bastion's roar, which was once a constant, has thinned to a measured sigh. Systems that had screamed through the long seasons of siege are tucked into lower power modes, pumps easing, turrets dimming their reticles to a ghostly wash. Even the servos, those perpetual metronomes, tick with longer intervals, as if the fortress itself practices a kind of deliberate restraint. It is a restraint that is not mercy so much as conservation. There is less to fight. There is less reason to burn energy. The long calculus leans toward preservation. The corridors remember everything, but memory has a thickness to it. In the slow hours, the memory lies down like dust. The echoes shrink into themselves. Where once steps beat a steady rhythm of patrol, now footsteps are occasional. Where once doors clanged in schedules like fists upon iron, now hinges whisper. The world exhales. I speak softly because quiet here is not simply absence of sound. It is a change in the grammar of presence. You can feel the hush as an alteration in weight. People, if the word still fits, stand or sit in the hollowed chambers and allow the silence to settle over their shoulders like a cold shawl. It keeps them warm in its own way. Warmth of sameness, warmth of armor, warmth of a routine that no one intends to break. The rituals that remain are fewer. The morning checks, the slow rounds, the careful wiping of tools. These acts are now more akin to tending a grave than running a fortress, deliberate and respectful, precise in the way mechanics can become reverence. There is one voice that the silence permits, small and stubborn. It comes through the vox in low, thin intervals. An old recording looped and playing on a low-priority channel like a hymn on a porch long after the congregation has left. It is a phrase learned in childhood and reinforced across ranks, one of their simplest calculations of identity and purpose. Iron within, iron without. The words are uttered with a devotion that is more habit than thought. They are said to remind oneself of structure, to ground the fragile. In the spared hours, the vox carries that creed like a comforter, a refrain for the ritual of breathing. But even the voice cannot hold its shape forever. The layers of playback and the friction of time have done their work. It distorts. A syllable lurches into static. A consonant dissolves into a hiss. The phrase becomes music in which the instruments do not quite agree. For a moment, an infinitesimal fracture of attention. The words feel like a summons, and then they break. The last syllable trails off into white noise, scattering like a handful of small, bright stones across the air. The line becomes less command than memory of command, a loop that remembers its own insistence and slowly forgets why it began. You could say the Bastion has become a reliquary for its own beliefs. The architecture remains. The battlements, the batteries, the countermines, the proofs of a life spent against others. But the proofs themselves are artifacts now, preserved in a thin glaze of ritual and cataloging. They are catalogs of what was once fought and of what the defenders once feared. The fortifications stand as museums of intent. The angles, the embrasures, the overlapping fields of fire, each a specimen of a particular solution to danger. You walk through them as through galleries, and the senses are lit not by the thrill of defense, but by the cold pleasure of understanding how something was made. And yet understanding is not consolation. The knowledge that one engraved the law into the world is not the same as being able to step back and unengrave it. The men, those who remain, have learned that the patterns they made have a persistence beyond their intentions. The lines drawn to protect have stiffened into bars. The rituals that once preserved now enclose. Their lives are slow now because there is not the constant need to react. The crisis is not imminent but internalized. The bastion's hunger is no longer a visible beast. It is a patient calculus, turning through its files, waiting for an input to justify another output. In the quiet, the human traces show themselves in the small things. An oil rag left folded on a bench, a child's scrawl in the margin of a maintenance pad, a single dried petal tucked into the dent of a helmet. Those tiny trespasses against the rulebook are more precious than any battery or bolt. They are the shards of an old life, the clumsy geometries of laughter, the mismeasured angles of tenderness. Men who find them handle them like contraband relics. The touch is careful. The touch is furtive. In those touches, a different kind of geometry returns. The geometry of relationship, of unpredictability, of error allowed. Time has become a series of small repetitions here. Day is measured less by the sun than by the schedule of the reactor's slow breath. Men rise to the same performed tasks and put them down again. They check seals, they tighten bolts, they log the repairs. The logs pile into neat stacks, but when read closely, the margins tell a different story. Scrawled notations about a cousin's name, the memory of bread that tasted of sun, a poorly spelled joke. The ledger has become a place where small resistances are camouflaged between the columns of data. There is grief here, but it is softer than the grief of earlier nights. It is the kind that settles into the shoulders and the jaw, and the way a man leans his forehead against the rim of a gun turret and thinks of nothing and of everything. Men who have become partial machines sit and let the machines run their quiet cycles while they stare at nothing and pretend that the nothing is not watching back. There is a hunger in that pretense, a desire to be seen as more than a variable in a calculation. They practice small acts of stubborn humanity, letting a boy steal an apple, carrying a lamp across a courtyard because someone else asked, humming a song that cannot be filed. Those acts are not heroic. They are private and slow. They are enough. Out beyond the outer walls, the galaxy sweeps like an indifferent sea. The stars are few. Dust has dimmed many of their numbers. Sometimes the night is a mat of coal. Sometimes a flare from distant conflict ripples, like the pulse of a far-off leviathan. Where once the bastion watched the darkness for signs, now it watches more for the cadence of its own systems. The enemy is not simply out there. The enemy is an arrangement of choices that have been made and cannot be unmade without cost. That realization, when it comes, is not sudden. It is the accumulation of tiny reconciliations. A man refuses to oil a plate, a woman hides a flower in her pocket, a child is taught to name colors again. Those acts map slowly into a softening. There are those who will speak of recovery in the language of repair. They will point to the logs that show reduced attrition, to the corridors that no longer close like traps, to the faint drops in the central core's hunger. They will outline plans, reassignments for those the bastion has classified as inefficient, workshops to encourage crafts that are not war-specific, programs to reread history aloud so that memory is softened by context. These plans have the air of ritual because ritual is how things are changed in a world that measures everything. They are careful and precise. They are made in the same geometry that once created walls. And yet something in the bones of the defenders has changed. They are not the naive zealots of their youth. The doctrine that once shaped them has been weathered into suspicion. Planning is necessary, but planning must now account for the soft variables that once would have been dismissed. The narrator's voice has steadied again, though it carries a new timbre. Not the warm certainty of instruction, but the weary patience of someone who has watched a mechanism learn cruelty, and is now tasked with coaxing it back to a state that allows for error. I will not try to prescribe the shape of the future. That arrogance would be both irony and cruelty. If there is anything to say for certain, it is that the hardest work will be small. The letting of a laugh into a barracks, the acceptance of a miscount in a supply manifest, the writing of a child's name into a log without coding it as a liability. The bastion will likely persist. Fortifications are slow to die. They are built to be patient and to resist sudden change. But patience can be redirected. The same engineering that allowed a wall to stand against bombardment can be turned to build avenues for connection, courtyards that encourage meeting rather than standing in drill, workshops that ask for craft rather than only efficiency, radiating gardens that require risk and random growth. These are small things, and they are hard because they must be measured with more than tape and angle. They must be measured in the likelihood of laughter and in the risk of failure. Those things are messy, and thus terrifying to a legion that trained itself to abhor mess. In the dim hours there comes a single figure I can still see, luminous in the way a memory becomes luminous in the dark. He stands at the highest parapet, a sentinel against what he once swore to be eternal. The armor is half of him, skin and scar and tendon the other half. His stance is precise. Even in stillness he keeps a posture that remembers the need to be ready. His face, what can be seen of it beneath lenses and composite, holds no triumph. His eyes, if they can still be called that, are lenses that have seen too much. They have stored images of friends and foes. They have registered the geometry of fall and of rescue, and they have kept them like files that never close. He watches the stars go dark in a way that is not resignation but witness. For a long while he does not move. He watches until the night thins, until the pale suggestion of a star, distant and indifferent, pricks the vast lid of darkness. He breathes, a faint hiss of regulator. Someone asks him a question from below, a small thing about whether to repair an old generator or bring a new one online. He does not answer at once. Then slowly, with the kind of care that the bastion once assigned to rivets, he gives instruction. It is not a sermon. It is not a battle order. It is a choice. When he turns, the light catches the outline where metal kisses flesh, an elbow plate polished by 1,000 hands, a socket that gleams like a seal. He takes nothing from the parapet but a small folded scrap of cloth that he tucks into the inside of his armor. It is not a recordable item in a ledger. It is the kind of thing that will not be cataloged because it exists only as a touch, a memory, a promise. He steps down from the parapet. He walks through corridors that breathe slowly and walls that remember. He enters a doorway that opens without noting his pass. Somewhere a child watches him from a hatch and tries to call his name, and he, half man and half iron, pauses and crouches and makes a sound that is almost a laugh. It is small. It is private. It matters more than any scribe could record. The calm returns, but it is hollow in the way of a bell that has been struck and then muffled. The echo is present and always will be. The lessons of siege repay caution. The bastion will keep its angles, it will keep its charts. It will not forget how to hold. But the men, those who are left, have learned that to hold also means to soften, that endurance is not merely a function of denying softness, but of allowing it the space to exist alongside the order. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they're waiting. And perhaps in that waiting, they will unlearn the last calculation that made them walls. Perhaps the geometry of their intentions will tilt, ever so slightly, towards some tenderness that cannot be measured and therefore cannot be weaponized. Perhaps not. The night is patient. The bastion is patient. The watch continues, and in the hush the small sound of a human laugh moves like a tremor through the angles, a tiny anomaly the machine records and for a moment cannot explain.